Hi, everybody. I'm Christie Wilson from Google, and I'm moderating this panel on the future of CICD with Kubernetes. So on our panel here, we have Carlos from CloudBees, we have Rob from Circle CI, we have Brandon from GitLab, and we have Samir from Pivotal. So I think maybe we could start off, and I'm the moderator, so I'm going to try to practice aggressively interrupting when things start taking too long, so just be prepared for that. I don't know how you'll know it's about to happen, I'll just jump in. Anyway, so let's start with maybe intros from each person, just a quick intro, what you're working on, yeah.
Okay, my name is Carlos Sanchez, I work at CloudBees. Related to this conference, I wrote the Kubernetes plugin for Jenkins like almost 5 years ago. And that's what brought me into Kubernetes and doing a lot of Jenkins and Jenkins stuff today. So a lot of Kubernetes. Did I say Kubernetes already? I don't know.
Hello. I'm Rob. I'm the CTO of Circle CI. Circle CI is a CI and CD platform. You can run it on our cloud or in yours. And we're focused on helping developers get their code into production faster and better. Been there about 5 years, and I don't know, Kubernetes. We run a big part of our platform on Kubernetes, and we help other people deploy to Kubernetes. So we do all kinds of Kubernetes.
Brandon Jung from GitLab. I'm subbing in for my awesome colleague Priyanka, who wasn't able to make it, but I work on partnerships and everything for GitLab. And we're focused, obviously, I think you probably know us as a source code management tool. We obviously also have a pretty robust CI, and we're kind of have been tackling this for a while around a single DevOps tool chain. You can give me feedback on that if you want to chat, because people seem to have opinions here. And then I think that's the big one.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samir. I work at Pivotal as an engineer. I'm currently working on Concourse, which is a CICD tool, which is born basically out of our lessons and building products at Pivotal, primarily Cloud Foundry. Prior to that, I've also worked on Spinnaker.
Cool. We could probably just hang on to the mic. We could just go backwards the next time. Yeah, so Kubernetes. I feel like a few years ago it was like Docker. So that's an interesting switch. Okay, so maybe next question, let's talk about changes in the CI/CD landscape. So specifically, I guess, around Kubernetes and containers, do you see that causing significant differences in how we view delivery, deployment, integration, that kind of thing? Do containers make things easier or harder? Let's go back through the group.
I'll start. I mean, I think there's definitely pros and cons. I think from the perspective of delivery and deployments, I think there is a difference. Containers are great where they package things up so that everything is super easy to run and portable. However, you do end up losing some flexibility, especially when something along the lines of security issues come up. Because everything is packaged up, you kind of lose that. So make some things easy, make some things harder. I think it's kind of a trade-off. The trade-off is generally worth it, but you keep the trade-off in mind in terms of what the cons are.
I'm going to echo it, largely similar. I'd say the packaging in Docker was a big change for us. It certainly allowed us on the CI space to think about it quite a bit differently than it had been before. Kubernetes is a great place to run it, and I think obviously all this work is really interesting to know how we come to a more similar answer to that question around scheduling, but certainly really useful, even where we are today. I think anyone would argue that building a pipeline is far easier with Docker and Kubernetes than where you were before. That said, while we're all pretty biased towards Kubernetes in the room, I think there's a lot of other people out there that aren't there yet.
I think from an overall future of CI and CD perspective, the thing that's really interesting to me is what sort of our use of Docker and Kubernetes is reflective of. So they've come along at a time where we've been shifting architectures from things that are very monolithic to things that are much more services based. And how we approach CI and CD has changed a lot as a result of that. So the things that you are integrating, the complexity of your environment has increased significantly. And so how we think about testing, right, as integration testing, sort of trying to build the perfect replication of your entire production environment has shifted to a point where it's almost starting to feel like a fool's errand. And so we've shifted into things like test in production. And so the definition of what we test, of what testing is and what deployment is shifting in that environment. I think it's a really interesting thing to be pursuing and thinking about how we do it well, because the tools that have helped us get to here are a little different from the tools that are going to help us to get to the next point, I would say.
Yeah, I think containers have revolutionized CI/CD in the sense that now the promise of this build once, run anywhere that we heard many times with different languages, different runtimes, kind of containers, Docker containers specifically, mostly do. The fact that you can run a container and get a totally different environment in seconds, this is something that was very used in CI/CD forever. Like, oh, I need to have these versions of Java with these versions of this other thing, and now I have to have 20 VMs with totally different configurations. I think containers have killed that. We must not forget that containers are not yet there for things like, I don't know, Internet of Things, devices. There's a big chunk of things that are not there yet. So yes, we are inside this Kubernetes bubble, but it has improved the life of our CI/CD configurations for a lot of people.
So maybe just to elaborate on something that you mentioned, Rob, so you mentioned that maybe with the complexity of the systems that we're working with now, it's a fool's errand to try to kind of piece together something exactly production-like for testing. Do you think that it's still worth attempting to test before you're in production, or do you think that this means we have to leave more until later? And then how does that affect this whole kind of shift left movement where we want to do more earlier?
I like that. I'm totally not dealing with this question kind of response. Hey, here's a microphone. So I think, yeah, it would be nuts to say like we should stop testing. But I think that the boundary of how much we can test effectively in a CI and CD platform before pushing is shifting a little bit. So I think for me personally, I think a lot about designing services to maximize the amount that you can test within the constraints of a single service versus trying to put the whole system together and do kind of end-to-end complete testing. And then it changes. So I think it changes my perspective anyway on how I think about what I want to build to make it as testable as possible in a small component. And then how I sort of monitor, manage, and operate a system once it's been deployed with effectively the expectation that I'm going to do, a slow rollout, like how I think about CD changes, and then I'm going to manage the expectation that at some point something's going to fail in that rollout, and I'm prepared to handle that. And so, to me, that's a very different model than we used back in the days of simple monoliths.
Yeah, I love that question because I've been talking about progressive delivery a lot in the last months. So progressive delivery as this concept that groups together things like canary deployments, blue-green. I mean, progressive delivery really makes something really scary like continuous deployment, makes it easier for people to manage and to be risk control, let's say. And I think that we'll see more and more this, I guess you could call it like testing in production, where you just deploy to some people and see what happens and automate all these steps. And I think it's where we're going to go because it's totally impossible you can only test for what you know. You cannot test for what you don't know. So at the end of the day, you have to control this blast radius when you deploy and have the tools that automate a safe deployment process.
I guess just to echo what was said previously, the one kind of interesting thing that our modern platforms allow us to do, specifically Kubernetes, is to differentiate what would be like business requirements testing, which could be shift left and really happen early on, versus the more experimental side, which would be more understanding how our users are going to use applications, which fundamentally becomes a much harder problem to reason about, and you generally cannot come to an answer other than trying it out. But I would kind of abstain from like doing functional testing about like business requirements and not doing that up front and just pushing early because it's cheap to do so, and kind of differentiate those two.
Okay, so from there, let's move on to another question. So what predictions do you have for 2019, 2020? Do you see shift left being big? What do you see changing in CICD?
I'll take a first crack at this. I think we already saw a lot of the movement already. I think just bluntly in the industry, we've seen a lot of consolidation. So I think that everyone has seen that. I'm biased. We tend to think of the world more, I guess, more monolithic. Just at GitLab, we think of a lot more in one application than historically where it's been. It seems like maybe it's going that way. I mean, obviously all of us will have a different point of view. And I think in some ways, again, it's the goal to shift left. So if you want to shift left, I mean, if you ask every individual developer, they have their favorite tool they want to use. The problem is that every individual developer has their favorite tool to use. And at some point, at scale, you have to choose something. And so I think that many choices that have been made over the years are going to have to start coming together. And some of it will naturally come together through acquisitions or decisions. Also see that security shifting left, which isn't that it hasn't already been there, but how do we make sure we're automating that as far and as early as possible is something we're seeing a lot more from our customers. Raise your hand.
It's all good. Just to take the very vendor-specific approach to this prediction, following Brandon's lead a little bit, I think that one thing that we see a ton from where we're sitting at Circle CI is people moving away from wanting to do a lot of these things themselves, like managing the tools, building and customizing tools, so they can focus on the core of their business. I would say from an overall perspective, I think I'm trying to figure out how to describe what I was saying earlier, but yes, we're trying to take as much as possible and shift it to the left, but I think that we're finding points where that's challenging, right? Where there are certain things, I think to Samir's point of, yes, we can do the functional testing early, we have a clear set of business requirements, whatever, but there are things we aren't going to understand. And so building more resilience into the product or into your own product, and then thinking about testing happening in phases all the way out into production, and focusing on resilience out at the right, kind of on the right, so that we can recover from those sorts of situations.
Yeah, I think we'll see more, on one hand, serverless type of things, like Tecton, just run your jobs when you have load and destroy them afterwards, and those type of solutions, and maybe even cloud providers providing the service for you, so you don't have to run it yourself. And I think we'll see more democratization of progressive delivery type of features. So something like canary deployments that right now Netflix or Facebook are doing, we'll see how that reaches the masses, and not everybody, you don't need to be a Facebook to do that, and that will reach more with the tooling, and hopefully the tooling we are building at CloudBees and with Jenkins X, you will be able to gain the benefits of doing canary deployments without having to do a complex setup or be a huge organization to manage that.
I think one thing that's been great to see is like the tooling has adopted and really improved where especially like some of the deployment platforms that are available, the tooling is really integrated with them. I think the thing that I'm kind of interested to see in the next little while is how companies are able to adopt this tooling. Especially at Pivotal, we work with really large enterprises. And while developers are super enthusiastic about adopting these technologies, and there's some growth in terms of like learning how to use them effectively, it's the process size changes or the organizational changes required to actually effectively have the company use those products. I think that's where there's a lot of challenges, and I think that'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out, where the technology is there, but the process still has to shift to adopt that technology.
So maybe kind of a related question. So we talked a bit about companies maybe offloading some of this work We talked about companies being able to take on more sophisticated deployment strategies, and you talked about organizational changes that you have to make. Do you see, what is the role of engineers in this? Like, do you think that, I think we also talked about engineers focusing on delivering business value. Should engineers care about their CI and CD pipelines? Should there be like one part of the organization that cares and engineers shouldn't, or should everybody care, or how do you see that working well? Loaded question.
I mean, I think, yeah, I guess I'd say I think everyone's going to need to know, continue to engage in this space. And even, I'll be blunt, even if we pretend it's not, developers will. So I don't suspect that many developers are just going to advocate on having an opinion. They want to work where their tools are. We had a customer who started someone, spent a bunch of time trying to get them hired, and literally the person quit in the first day because they didn't have the tools they wanted. So, and that's at a huge company. So it happens still that matters. I mean, whether you should over-optimize to it, I don't know. I also think from the standpoint of them being engaged, back to like security becoming more and more important, like they're going to have to know how that runs. They're going to have to be engaged in it. So I don't know that they're ever not going to be a part of it. I think that's still going to be day to day, but.
I think for me as an engineer, I really enjoy kind of knowing what my company's mission is. And from that perspective, I'm biased that way. I feel like most engineers really get a sense of contentment by being aligned with the company's mission. So if it matters how a product is operated and like how the CI/CD is set up, then for sure they would care to know and be involved in that. Having said that, I think the promise of cloud native and what the kind of revolution that's happening right now is it allows you to like focus and reason about the smallest abstraction at a time, whether it's a function or a application, and not worry about everything else at that time, and then shift focus. So it's not like you're only doing one thing, but you're only doing one thing at a time, which then allows you to like really be zoned in. So from that perspective, there might be a session or a time where you really care about how your CI/CD is set up and really just improve that process, because that might lead to business improvements. And then you might shift your focus again and working on something else at that point.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Sameer's point about being mission-driven. Like as an engineer, I want to be driving the value that is what my company is trying to drive. But I would say, being in the middle of this space, as we all are, if the tools are getting in your way and preventing you from getting something out, like the ability to build something and then see it in the hands of your users is a big part of that kind of enrichment of being mission-driven. If the tools are getting in your way, then that's going to frustrate you as an engineer, and that's going to force you to be really thoughtful about the tools that are being used. I think you mentioned in there specific groups. I do see a shift, and it depends on the size of your company, but many companies already have this towards, and I think the previous speaker was talking about a meetup of developer productivity groups, right? Like that notion of teams that are internally focused and really trying to build out the best possible tooling to help the engineers then focus on the very small thing that they're concerned about today, which is hopefully not the pipeline today, because the pipeline is there and it just works. If I, as a product engineer, am trying to build something for customers, and every day I'm thinking about how can I get this pipeline to work properly for me, that's a sign of a pretty bad pipeline, I would say.
I would ask anybody here, raise your hand if you want to manage your CI/CD day-to-day operations. There's like 5 very passionate people that want to do that. So, yeah, I think we'll find engineers that are very passionate about automating things, but I don't think anybody wants to manage the day-to-day, like, oh, this broke because some machine is down or because the cloud is not working today or something. And yeah, it's something that you want to automate things, but at some point you will just want them to work, and then you just want to move on to the next thing. So it's something that it's hidden from a lot of people, and a lot of people only know what's going on and the effort it takes to set up those things when they break. So it's not a very rewarding situation for anybody, I guess.
Okay, so next question then. So as CI/CD becomes more cloud native, what, if anything, do you see getting left behind? And do you think that that's a problem? Should we be focusing more effort? Is there an answer? So for example, like mobile, embedded IoT, that sort of thing.
COBOL mainframes, yeah. Yeah, I think we are, as I said before, we are in a bubble and we are all like Kubernetes fans, and then you talk to people and they're like, oh, I cannot use Kubernetes because, I'm building device firmware and so I have to run it in this device, or I have to do these other things. So there is a lot of use case out there that are not covered by Kubernetes. There's a lot of progress, like Windows support and different architectures being supported. But I guess there's a number of things that are not gonna be Kubernetes friendly anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key is what is your deployment target, right? Like the thinking about, and of course there's two sides to this, like where is the thing I'm building going, and then how do I operate the tooling to do the testing, right? And those are sort of two things, are testing and deploy. So some of the things you mentioned are top of mind for me. I mean, people still build desktop apps. That's a thing, right? Mobiles, I mean, we run a giant data center full of Macs to get, iOS builds done, stuff like that. I mean, these are not things that are going to easily go away. And I definitely think that we need to pay attention to that as we think about, like, you can optimize for one, but you're going to leave other things behind. And generally, my perspective, because that's what we see in our customer base, is people want to have a single or standard solution to test for all of the different things that they're building, right? And I mean, who's not building a mobile app? I'm sure someone would be able to put up their hands. But I mean, everybody has a mobile app for some reason at this point, right? I wouldn't say everyone has IoT or embedded devices, but those are real things, like real problems. We see, I'm trying to think of other examples. Yeah, I guess we see a lot of demand for specific hardware types, for example, even on server-side applications like GPU and stuff like that. That feels like it's still a stretch. Specific virtualization capabilities. Like there's just more stuff than I would have thought that people are using that are kind of independent of our view of that everything can be abstracted into a container.
I'll just check it out. We see a whole lot of stuff that's not Kubernetes. So I also think a lot of our discussions implicitly sort of suggest that what everyone's trying to develop is at massive scale. I mean, at the point you're saying you're going to canary deployment, you're implying you have a pretty large application, which is fantastic. But the majority of applications aren't actually that. So we still see a lot of need for the different environments, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I think this is very useful, but as much as it can be abstracted in any way, shape, or form to serve the rest of what's outside of Kubernetes is going to be a really important part if we want this to serve the rest. Again, I think if we want to put our heads down and say most SaaS applications are going to be Kubernetes, I think most people in the room would be like, yeah, sure, we agree with that. But in some ways, we kind of jump over, I think we have a habit of jumping way over where the majority of the market actually exists. And so, there's a lot of places that a lot of these technologies aren't as needed. And again, maybe we just explicitly decide, at least in the cloud native space, to say it's going to be cloud native and that's what we're going to focus on. But at least I think for a number of the other, for us up here, we have to address a number of areas outside of Kubernetes. And we still see a ton of work there.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you just said. Where for Concourse, just some numbers, we have roughly about a quarter of our deployments on Kubernetes, but we still have a ton of Windows applications being built, Mac OS X applications or iOS apps where users want to be able to use our system to test there and to build their applications. So we don't see that going away. I think for us, it's how we can evolve our product such that we don't leave those behind, but are still able to leverage the things that are offered on Kubernetes, for example. So figuring out how we can balance both, so we kind of deliver both, that's definitely a challenge that we're kind of looking forward to.
Okay, so maybe for people in the audience, so assuming that you're bought into the idea of continuous delivery in general, which maybe that's not the right assumption to make, so just correct me if that's wrong. But assuming you're bought into that, what do you think is the biggest, what change could people make today that would give them the most benefit? And do you have any stories around seeing that kind of thing And everyone's been really great to moderate so far because everyone's been taking a very reasonable amount of time. So, but feel free to dive into stories if you'd like. And I can just jump in if they're too long.
So we at Pivotal work with large enterprises, and we kind of work closely with them where we help them set up their CI and then set up CD. And the challenge we see time and time again is it's very easy to like take one or two applications and kind of set up the whole process going from like writing your application to actually having it deployed and having it deployed continuously. The challenge longer term is how you drive that organizational shift where besides the developers or the few people that are kind of involved on an application, how do you get everyone involved? So how do you kind of liaise with the security personnel or the security team? How do you liaise with the operations team? And how do you kind of get everybody on board to kind of drive that? So for me, I feel like that's probably the biggest area where the difficulty comes in. Developers generally love the idea of continuous delivery, and the product managers that are kind of working with them who are trying to drive business value kind of see the benefits of that as well. It's the other supporting organizations that are there as part of the company that for them, the continuous delivery brings the aspect of change, which then brings risk, and they're generally, the other supporting teams are trying to mitigate that risk. So it's balancing that out.
And do you see is there anything that you see organizations doing that particularly helps make that less painful?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for us would be getting buy-in from all of the kind of component groups or the functional groups in an organization, as opposed to kind of just working with developers. So if the whole company or all the folks kind of involved that are touching an application from committing the source code all the way to the application delivery or having it deployed, if everyone's kind of involved, we kind of at Pivotal, we call that having a balanced team, where you have like a stakeholder from every kind of functional unit represented and working together. That generally leads to much better success outcomes from actually having CD there and then being leveraged successfully in the longer term.
Definitely echo some of this, the challenge of one team or one being experts and how that gets shared more broadly. I think the other piece we see is for it to be really successful, it has to be across the entire development cycle. So it's cycle time compression that matters, and so CD is right at the end of it. You still have to solve that from CE, source code, your planning, downstream. And so being able to quickly turn stuff in and ship every day is great, but it has to be able to be tied all the way back to when you're starting in your planning. So if that whole cycle isn't all be able to run really quickly, it's just like it's like having a supply chain, right? Or having in a supply chain and you have a constraint. So if you open up the constraint, you can deliver really quickly. If you can't get back upstream to where you're planning and that's all tied together, again, you won't get there. And tools are a piece of it, people are a piece of it, and process are a part of it. But I think we find, obviously with GitLab, we find since we work with customers all the way from the planning to the CD piece, the ones that do really, really well, and I'll use like Goldman, who does a great job, but they went from about shipping every 2 weeks down to inside of an hour. And that wasn't just because they did CD. Like that was very useful, very important, but they also had to change and deal with planning all the way upstream. So they had to be able to think about the way in which they're actually building into smaller and smaller little pieces, right? So instead of saying, we say MVP, I think an MVP is nice, but it's still a big chunk of work. Like think of it as a minimal viable change, right? I will ship, literally if I change one word, I'll still, one word changes, but it's better than it was yesterday, I'll ship it. Now CD enables that, but you have to start with the notion of innovation or of iteration at the very front. You have to be willing to take everything on the front end all the way through and get into that mindset of churn, ship. And that I think that whole tool's where you gotta have all the pieces, because otherwise you're able to ship at the end, but no one at the front end is still, Kanbaning it up into a bunch of big pieces, and those chunks aren't gonna make it through as fast. So I think that's what we see.
I would agree with that. I want to go back to the risk mitigation idea for a second. I think one of the things, like I remember in 2011, I started a company with someone, and he was sort of doing product, and I was leading technology, and sort of CD was becoming a thing at the time, right? There was some Etsy blog posts or who knows, and he said, I think we should do this continuous deployment. I was like, no, you're crazy. Deployments are risk, and risk is scary, and I'm the one that's going to have to do it, and I don't want your scary risk. And it only took about 24 hours of actually reading the blog post to be like, wait a second, this makes sense. Because what we're doing is taking that risk and minimizing it, right, into these tiny, tiny little acceptable chunks. And it's really that shift in mindset that I think has to happen inside the organization. I mean, to Brandon's points, like tools are great, but tools just enable you if you have the right people and the right process. And so getting your head around reducing risk by creating those really small incremental changes and being able to deal with them is probably the biggest mind shift, I think, for people. The other thing that I would say in terms of tools, now going back to tools, how to think about this in a way to help you get over the hump. Really feeling confident in what you have deployed, meaning improving your observability, things like exception, I don't know what they're called, the roll bars of the world. I'll just give a shout out to my friends over there. Like being able, so when something does go wrong, knowing that you have the tooling and instrumentation to recognize that it happened gives you that extra confidence to just do it all the time, right? Like, I can't remember what conversation I was in recently where someone was surprised that we weren't paying attention to a deploy happening. I'm like, we deploy all the time. I mean, if everyone has to stop what they're doing and look at that, that's going to be a real problem for us, right? And that kind of mental shift only comes with that comfort that you get from knowing that if something does go wrong, everyone's going to know about it and be able to respond to it.
Yeah, I think continuous delivery is first and foremost a cultural change, right? You need the culture of your group or company to change and understand what it means and tear down the silos and adopt DevOps. I mean, this is what all DevOps was about at the beginning, before everything was DevOps. And so that was that's the main idea. I mean, you need a cultural change first, and then tools will follow. Obviously, it's pretty hard to do continuous delivery if you don't have the tools. I would say it's impossible, but cultural change is first. You cannot have operations people, developers on different sides of the wall and fighting over who has to deploy or maintain what. And that's the main issue you have to face. And the soonest the better.
Okay, so along the lines of sort of advice for people in the audience, do you have any advice about how to get the right size of CICD for your organization? Like whether you need to have use tools that require an entire team to run versus something that's just quick and fast and works well, and like when should you have a dedicated team that runs your CICD versus just like small things that work for each individual team?
That's an interesting question because for some time there was the opinion of, everybody should not do DevOps, everybody should be doing the same things and not just throwing something to the DevOps team. I mean, definitely you should not call your operations team the DevOps team. We've seen that a lot. And if you call the DevOps team, I don't know, the group of people that helped you improve the process to achieve faster delivery, maybe you could call them like that. It's not great, but it's just unavoidable today, I guess. But what was the question?
So how do you pick the right size? Choose
yeah.
tools that are small and focused, and every team chooses their own, or have like one big monolithic thing that everyone in the company has to use that takes like a team to operate.
Having to manage we've seen, unless you are one of the few here that love it, having to manage your CICD is not going to be a huge investment of your time, and I think you should try to use the economy of scale. So if your company provides you, it's the same as having a platform as a service deployment or using the cloud. If you have somebody that can provide you that service and you only have to, tweak things and adapt it to what you have, I think that's great for productivity. So I think you should always try to avoid to reinvent the wheel in your team if other teams are doing that. There's some specific cases to do that, but that's the minimum.
And if you feel like I'm treading ground that we already covered and you just don't want to answer it, that's also okay too. But,
Too late.
yeah, sorry.
I have thoughts. Couple things. So on the team front, I totally agree. I rant about like DevOps teams constantly as a title. I apologize to anyone in the room who's on a DevOps team. But I think this notion of developer productivity, engineering efficiency, like teams that do shared work, basically, not I'm building your pipeline for you, but I'm building the common tools. Yeah, building common tools that other teams can use to deliver that stuff. So for us, I mean, obviously we run cloud-hosted CI, so CI and CD, and so we don't really think about you giving that to another team in your org, but rather giving a bunch of it to us. But even if you do that, you're going to have some standard pipeline that you might use across multiple projects, right? And so building that kind of tooling and sharing it across teams so they're not rebuilding the same things, that are tied to how you think about building out your repos or how your deploy runs, whatever those things are, having, in a small org, it might just be that you get together and chat about it and someone implements it. In a slightly larger org, you might start to have one person, two people who are responsible for this engineering efficiency, developer productivity, whatever you want to call it. And I just think that it's leverage at some point, right? Letting everyone build their own version of the pipeline on top of the tool, whatever tool you might be using, you're going to have to build something on top. Letting everyone do it differently within your org, you're eventually going to regret that and come back and try to, consolidate is my view.
Yeah, so we look at it, it's not either or, I guess, and I guess, because we should get Labshifts all as one tool, so you're not really choosing, the only real choice, if you wanted to use the whole tool is, do you want it managed in our SaaS offering, or do you want to run it yourself? So I guess it's a little different because at least if you adopted GitLab, you would end up with a bunch of different pieces. That said, we still obviously integrate with a lot of different places. I think the planning is the part that's most intriguing to me as of late is the planning team have visibility into the pipeline and vice versa? Because that's usually where the break kind of becomes, like someone might run your pipeline, but if the team that's doing the planning sees when their pipeline gets implemented, they can see it, there's a different level of interaction if they have the visibility there than I think we'd seen before. But I think it's a newer area, whether at least this fully integrated notion is a newer idea.
When you say planning, are you talking about like planning features or planning like the pipeline execution? Or?
Planning features, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. Feature planning, not planning the pipeline is also important, but probably not as much between those two.
As an engineer, I think I really like flexibility. So it would be hard for me to look at kind of generic decisions in terms of everyone has to use a hosted solution or everyone has to run their own system. I think thinking about exactly what problem you're trying to solve and what would be the most optimal way, and you kind of top down or bottom up deciding that, I think that's the most empowering, and that's a system or kind of structure that makes the most sense to me. Kind of thinking of it in the sense of the Pareto principle, where 80% of applications probably can run with a centrally managed system, versus there'll be the 20% that need to do something that's slightly out there for performance reasons or any other reasons, where then they really want the flexibility, and then they're probably willing to take the trade-off of managing their own system and kind of taking that burden on. Looking at it internally at Pivotal, we use Concourse extensively at Pivotal. At this point, it's about 500 engineers kind of using the system. What's kind of naturally and organically kind of evolved is we have a managed system or managed version of Concourse that my team actually runs, so that any team, if they just care about running a pipeline, they don't want to take on the burden of managing the system, they kind of have that available. But there are teams that run the version of Concourse themselves as well. And the reason they choose to do so is because there's one team that is building artifacts in multiple cloud regions. And this way they have workers distributed across the globe. There's another team that is working on data products, and they're shipping artifacts that are usually about 5 to 10 gigabytes in size. And what they have done with their deployment of Concourse is optimize the network topology. So This way they have the flexibility of like running the system exactly that they would want to, but not having to like have other teams that only care about running a pipeline, and it's quite trivial for them that they don't have to take on the burden.
We're pretty much out of time, but I'm going to give you a chance to say just 1 or 2 sentences more, just a parting thought that you'd like to leave the audience with. If they don't remember anything else that we talked about, they should remember this. No pressure.
I think for me, there's no like one tool that kind of solves a problem. I think I prefer to think about it as like pick the best tool that gets the job done. And really, if it's cloud native or not, that doesn't matter. As long as you're kind of continuously thinking about the reasons and then reevaluating those, pick the tool that works the best. And also work on process. Process is important.
I'd learn how to iterate, get comfortable with iteration across anything, tool or otherwise. I think that's the most important piece I've seen that makes a difference.
Culture is more important than tools.
Damn, you took mine. I'm going to say something that happened 15 years ago when we were pitching Apache Maven to the CTO of American Express. And people were complaining like, Maven was all about the standardization of your build. And people were saying, oh, but my build is special. And his answer was like, maybe it shouldn't be, right?
Cool. Great. Well, thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for being so easy to moderate also.